and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The war on drugs has shaped criminal justice systems worldwide, including here in Malaysia. But are we fighting a losing battle when it comes to the war on drugs? Neil Woods is a former undercover police officer who spent 14 years infiltrating some of the most dangerous criminal networks. Now, his frontline experience with law enforcement showed him the unintended consequences of drug prohibition. Consequences that not only shaped his perspective, but also made him a leading voice in global drug policy reform. So I'm delighted to welcome him to the show, Neil Woods, who is a board member of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, or known as LEAP, which advocates for evidence-based drug policy and criminal justice reform. The group is made up entirely of serving and former police and other law enforcement officials. So Neil, welcome to the show. It's good of you to join me. You have such an interesting story, and I want to maybe begin our conversation with that. Talk to me a little bit about your time as an undercover undercover officer in law enforcement. You spent so much of that risking your life, but it's also given you a perspective about the way we treat drug crime. So was there a moment in your career where it was almost pivotal that changed the way you look at how we tackle drug-related crime?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me on, Melissa, to talk about this. I suppose, I mean, I look back and I think that actually I was quite slow on the uptake because I did that work for so long, the undercover work and other covert investigation, that the evidence was before my eyes, but because I was so committed to the fight, and I had blind faith in what I was doing, you know, these were the laws, these were what I was instructed to do, that all of the doubts that I had over those years, I pushed to one side until they were just too much or too many. So, I mean, I can give you one example, if you like, of one of my real light bulb moments, if you want me to. So I used to, I would go from city to city in the UK. I went as far north as Leeds, as far south as Brighton, lots of places. And I would generally work for about 6 or 7 months in one location. And one of the investigations I did was into a notorious gang called the Burger Bar Boys. Now, as I travel around the world, people tell me that's a very British name for a gang. It doesn't sound very scary, does it? The Burger Bar Boys, but they were intensely violent. Just before the operation I did, they had machine gunned 2 young women in a battle with some rivals, and one of the main targets that I had was implicated in 7 different murders. So I manipulated very vulnerable people to introduce me to them, and I would always look for the most vulnerable to manipulate, because the most vulnerable people are the easiest to manipulate. And if that sounds if that sounds ruthless, well, of course it's ruthless. That is the nature of drugs policing, that we can cause harm to vulnerable people in order to catch drug dealers. But I spent 7 months investigating this gang. I thought I was going to die on multiple occasions. They even stripped me at gunpoint one day. They wanted to check I didn't have a wire. So I thought I was going to die on multiple occasions in this operation. At the end of it, at the end of 7 months, I'd gathered evidence against 96 people, the 6 main gangsters who were the targets, but 90 of their sort of support systems, the sex workers who were working for them, the runners, the people who were doing the stashes and all sorts of things. And I thought, wow, this is going to sweep the city clean. This is just going to solve the problem. And there was hundreds of police brought in from the surrounding police forces, enormous resources. And after the arrest phase, the intelligence cell officer who was tasked with keeping his ear to the ground said to me afterwards, yes, Woodsy, we managed to interrupt the drug supply in the city of Northampton for a full 2 hours. 7 months of work, being quite convinced I was going to die, all of those resources for the sake of interrupting the drug supply for 2 hours. And, you know, that futility really hit me, because by that stage in my career, I knew that I was causing harm to vulnerable people who needed help in order to manipulate them. I was causing harm to people who needed treatment, not prison, for the sake of a goal that I believed in, you know, that this was going to have an impact to make our streets safer. But This is worse than futility, because actually the net result of most police operations anywhere in the world, especially in any urban environment, is actually an increase in violence, because the police never reduce the size of the market, never reduce the size of it, but what they do is they change the shape of it. And what that changing shape means is that if you arrest a gang, an established gang, or even a kingpin type character, you create a gap in the market. And that makes rival gangs or other rival would-be kingpins very excited, because it's an opportunity. And in fact, if you go to business school, if you go to a business economics lecture,
yes,
and you ask a business lecturer, how do I create market opportunity and market growth? They will say, disrupt the market. Of course, this is what the police are doing all of the time.
So the police are disrupting the drug market.
In a never-shrinking market. Yeah.
And so when there's a vacuum, other players come in and fill the space.
Yeah, and sometimes fight over it, which increases violence.
Okay. So you have argued before, Neil, that the war on drugs and prohibition policies often create these lucrative black markets, right? You argue that it emboldens organized crime. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that and how reforming drug policies can help dismantle or weaken organized crime groups?
Yes, certainly. So consider drugs policing sharpens the sword of organised crime. It makes organised crime more ruthless through adaptation. It's a survival of the fittest situation. In a never-shrinking market, organised crime always adapts to the police, and actually they have more resources, because the drugs business worldwide is the 4th or 5th biggest market in the world in value, bigger than textiles.
Wow.
We're all wearing textiles, which gives you an idea of the size of the scale of this. Unregulated, untaxed, and in the hands of the most ruthless people in our society. But they are made ruthless because the most ruthless are the ones who adapt to police tactics the best, the ones who intimidate communities to not provide information to the police. So we're constantly driving this step towards ruthlessness. So the way to combat organised crime, and I should add that I've been here in Malaysia now doing some university lectures and working with the brilliant Malaysian drug policy programme, doing meetings and all sorts of things. The conversation is very often here and around the world, like it should be, about human rights and the right to health, and the fact that people who are addicted have a health issue, not a moral failing. All of those conversations are important and it should be led by that. However, I'm at heart still a police officer, and what I'm in this fight for is to fight organised crime. So drug law reform is not just good for health and public health and for human rights. It's also good at reducing crime and, most importantly, reducing the power of organised crime. So there are two different methods by which we can take this power away from organised crime. Perhaps the most difficult to accept is the fact that we need to take this business away from them. We need to take legal control of the drug markets. So that means that we need to have a very sensible, strict and controlled legal regulation of cannabis, for example. We need to do it better than your neighbours did, for example, because they didn't bring the regulation in. We need to look to where they do it well in the world, like Canada, where the legal regulation of cannabis has reduced child consumption, for example. We need to look at the evidence of how to protect our children better. So that's legal regulation. But that's not really part of the discussion in most countries, and certainly not the major part of the discussion here in Malaysia. But what is possible here, and is being talked about seriously, is decriminalisation. True decriminalisation, not like the reforms you did a year ago where you can still get fines. True decriminalising people who use drugs.
What do you mean by that? What does true decriminalisation look like in practice?
It means that anybody who uses drugs or has possession of drugs is not criminalised. Because if you criminalise them, they're not going to get help. You need to instead keep them completely away from the criminal justice system and steer them towards help. Now, bear in mind that between 80 and 90% of people who use drugs will never develop an addiction. That's the facts. That's the evidence. they will never develop an addiction. But for the percentage of people that do develop an addiction, they need different levels of help. Some people need a lot of help, rehabilitation, and some people need significantly less help. But it is medical professionals who are qualified to make those judgments, not police officers, not prisons, certainly not prisons. The worst possible thing you can do to somebody who uses drugs is send them to prison. And I'll be clear about this, organised crime do not want Malaysia or anywhere else to decriminalise possession. Organised crime do not want that. They don't. Because organised crime love to have a captive population of vulnerable people in prison. In prison, drugs are freely available. There is not a drug-free prison anywhere in the world, no matter how wealthy the country. Prisons all have drugs. That's a fact. But what people are not considering is the economic drivers of how that produces crime. Because drugs are 4 times more expensive on average around the world, 4 times more expensive in prison than on the outside. And it's the same organised crime gangs supplying on the inside as the outside. So if people can't barter with some things in prison, they have a line of credit. And there is often a sophisticated way of working out the credit, the levels of interest, and how you're going to pay it off. And quite often, what that means is your family on the outside are going to be the people who are exploited to pay off that drug debt. Whether it's someone gets exploited sexually, which is common, or to commit crime, or if someone comes out of prison, they have this huge debt. Organised crime love that because they can make you commit all sorts of crime. Vulnerability
to exploitation, right?
The drivers, the multipliers involved in creating crime are extraordinary. So why are we doing something which financially increases crime?
Okay. Neil, I have to ask you, so when we think about the way the war on drugs have shaped the criminal justice system and the response to drug-related crimes, how does that, if we were to think about reform, what is needed to dismantle this entrenched mindset of we must eradicate or we must fight this war on drugs to the death? Well, how do we think that through in terms of reforming not just a national approach, but right down to the bones of it?
Well, I mean, a reframing is important because I'm still fighting organised crime. I'm just using different tactics. So it's still a good fight. It's still fighting the good fight, fighting organised crime. But we need to stop this stigmatising of people who use drugs because people who do develop an addiction, this is a chronic illness. Okay. What other chronic illness do we send people to prison for? So
are most criminal justice systems not taking into account the fact that evidence says or data says 80 to 90% of people who use drugs never develop an addiction? What have you observed here in Malaysia?
Okay, yes, it is rare for anybody to consider the facts because what we're sold with the media, even TV dramas or whatever it is, we're sold this idea that if you use drugs, you are addicted, which is just simply not true. And actually the idea that some drugs are much worse than others, actually statistically the most dangerous drug is alcohol. And yet that's the one that most countries have as legal. And the evidence is quite clear, it's by far the worst, both to society and to individuals. But what I've observed here in Malaysia, and I've learnt a lot while I've been here, and it's been quite eye-opening, is that how much of your drug laws and your criminal justice systems are a hangover from empire. So I'm one of those British people who actually feels the generational shame of what my nation has done to other nations. But I was still surprised with the situation here. So for example, the Malaysian drug policy programme is trying to get to end the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1952. 1952 was still British rule, and that law was brought in and imposed by the British. But at that time in Britain, we didn't have such harsh laws. And in fact, we never have, and we still don't, because that law criminalises the consumption of drugs, not just the possession or trafficking, the consumption. Consumption has never been illegal in the UK, never, still isn't. And in fact, the view is taken that an Englishman's blood, or the contents of an Englishman's blood or his urine, is his own business. It's private. And that was the attitude in 1952. So also if you consider your bail, right, you have financial bail here, which means that if you have to get bail from a court, rather than be remanded in prison, it's about how much, whether you can pay or not. I mean, that's criminalising poverty, right? We don't have that in the UK, and when we imposed that on Malaysia, we didn't have it. To get bail in the UK, it's whether the prosecution have to prove that you're a risk of reoffending or that you're a risk of not turning up to court. But that was based on racism, the idea that a white person can be trusted to turn up to court, a brown person cannot be trusted. So that law, the bail law, and your Dangerous Drugs Act was about control from a racist lens that colonials, the people that we controlled through empire, needed more control. And you've still got these laws. You've still got these systems. You're still putting people in prison for consuming drugs.
That's incredible that you've pointed that out. I didn't realize that there was such a difference in the way the colonial hangover still lingers here in Malaysia. When we are, so you go around the world and advocate for reform of drug policies and the criminal justice system. What are some of the things you have seen work in your advocacy, in getting that message across and therefore it leading to action? Are there things that you have noted that actually works?
Yeah, well, thankfully, we're living in an age where drug law reform is the norm. It's the direction of travel all over the world. And it's also supported by all of the UN agencies. The Commission on Human Rights very recently has been speaking specifically on drug policy being a barrier to good human rights. But there are so many good examples. I mean, Portugal is cited very often, but because it's a good example. They were the leaders in decriminalisation in 2001 to tackle a drug death crisis and a health crisis. And the positive results in Portugal are extraordinary. Now, drug use overall has not reduced in Portugal. It stayed the same. But the most important statistic is that problematic drug consumption has gone down in Portugal. They have been able to deal with their addiction problems much more effectively. Their associated crime has substantially gone down. Switzerland is a especially good example because in 1994, because of their heroin problem, they decided to prescribe heroin. And the killer for me is that they used British evidence for this at a point when Britain went in the wrong direction. But because the government took control of the heroin supply so that anyone addicted was given heroin, actual clinical grade heroin, not just substitution, actual heroin, to protect them from the exploitation of organised crime, it means that now they don't have a heroin problem, unlike the rest of Europe, apart from the Netherlands, because they copied the Swiss model. Switzerland and the Netherlands, they don't have a heroin problem anymore. The tiny amounts of heroin. In the UK, we have 50,000 children being exploited to sell heroin. 50,000 children. Wow. That's the way that prohibition has done that. Policy has done that. In Switzerland, that's never going to happen because the government controls what is now a tiny heroin market.
Any observations based on your work with LEAP? Because that's a coalition or a grouping of law enforcement, people who were in law enforcement or are still in law enforcement. Are there observations that you can give through the perspective of a law enforcement lens? Yeah,
so as you pointed out, I'm the board member of the LEAP in the USA, but our movement is worldwide. You know, we have police who are even if they're not members, they're part of our movement. And I think that one of the most important things is the growth of cannabis legal regulation. Okay. You know, across the United States and in Canada, because this is taking an enormous amount of money away from organised crime that can be invested in the treatment for people who need help from the other drugs. I mean, it's less likely that you'll be addicted to cannabis than some other drugs, but that money can be reinvested and is reinvested. But of course, there are different models of cannabis regulation. Some are much better than others.
So the arguments you're making today are very compelling. You've done the research, you have the lived experience of it. But what would you say, Neil, have been the most common form of resistance? What's the pushback that you hear most frequently when you do your work in advocacy?
Well, wherever I go, everyone says to me, doesn't matter what the country is, everyone says to me, we're a very conservative country.
Everyone says that.
Everybody says that. Everybody says that. And they say that this is difficult for us to accept because we're taught that drug use is a moral failing. Well, judging things as a moral failing hasn't got us very far. You know, we need to just take a pragmatic view.
How do you respond to that argument? I've heard that before. The misconception or that really embedded idea that drug use is a moral failing, and if you just pulled yourself up with your bootstraps, you will be able to fight it or stop using it.
Well, I learned from my experience mingling with vulnerable people, because all of the vulnerable people I met, they all had a story. Every single one of the people I met who were using drugs problematically all had a story, and it was all childhood trauma. All childhood trauma. I remember speaking to one young woman who said, I can stop taking heroin, and I do sometimes to bring my tolerance down. But when I do, I remember the feeling of my uncle's fingernails when he sexually abused me as a little girl. So for me, heroin is a pragmatic decision because it numbs that emotional pain. And when we consider that, was that a moral failing on her part? I learnt firsthand that the people who are using drugs problematically all have these stories. They've all been neglected, they've had physical abuse or sexual abuse. But now, since I've become an activist, I read all of the academic evidence which supports that. And there is a wealth of evidence that these are people who are traumatized. Are they suffering a moral failing, or are they self-medicating? People who use drugs use it for different reasons. I personally do not care if someone uses a drug for fun. This is what I've learned. I just want people to be safe. Our young people, I just want them to survive so they can grow out of mistakes, so that they have a future. I don't want to ruin our young people's future by criminalising them for a mistake or a decision that they make in their youth. So I think the best way for us to get past this entrenched feeling, and it's a feeling, and it's not an evidence, it's a feeling. To get past it is to commit to following the evidence. And I don't think that's too much to ask. I certainly don't think it's too much to ask of our police, who can sometimes be the vocal opponents of reform.
Okay. Well, so in the couple of minutes that we have left, what key message would you have, not just to the public who are watching tonight, who may be made up of policymakers or law enforcement officers? Do you have a message or a key lesson that Malaysia should think through and consider if we really want to see meaningful change in this area? Well, you have an unusual situation here in Malaysia in that you have a really dedicated, extremely knowledgeable team of people working on this, and that's the Malaysian Drug Policy Programme. You have some of the best experts in the world here, which gives you an opportunity to actually show leadership. And you know what I'd really love to see? What I would really love to see is Malaysia actually showing up Britain and actually getting ahead of Britain in reforms and being a world leader, a thought leader. And you have that opportunity here because you have some good politicians, you have good universities, thought leaders, and the Malaysian Drug Policy Programme. So anyone listening to this, please, offer them what support you can. And any students out there, design some social media to support what's going on. And please tag me in anything. If you do something good on social media, let's get it viral. Let's show the world that you're the leaders here. Get the word out. Neil, thank you so much for being here, sharing your experiences and your insights. I appreciate it. Thanks. Thank you so much. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.